what will make you good. Because your children need that you should be good, so that you can teach them and provide a role model and everything else that's needed. He then goes on, and again, very countercultural for us. He says that God heard what you said. And God said, I have heard all that this people said. Oh, that they would have such a heart and mind as this to keep my law. But they will not. He knew. And they didn't. So if that kind of experience doesn't work to make you good, we might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we're going to do it again. But Moses says, no. And then you come to the Ten Commandments after that introduction. And the introduction to the Ten Commandments in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 is the same. Anybody know what phrase introduces the first thou shalt not? That's right. Good. I'm glad that at least 1% of the Baptists still read the Bible. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. That's the introduction in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. You know what that is doing? Grace introduces the law. They couldn't get out of Egypt on their own. Grace got them out of Egypt. So legalism is not incompatible with grace. Grace is necessary for legalism to make any sense, because we can't do it on our own. And God gives no rationale for those Ten Commandments. He's not a bureaucrat. It's very simple. 10 Commandments which all children used to know when I was a child, because those precious early years in school, the Bible was read every day when I was at school. For 12 years in school, every day the Bible was read. On this continent, the idiots who rule and the blind demagogues of the other side took the Bible out of school in the 1960s. I grew up in the equivalent of Detroit, in a working class area. We did not lock our doors. The police never visited. There was no divorce. If a boy was rude to Mrs. X, he would feel his father's displeasure quite vigorously. It was a very safe environment. Not anymore. They've got to be enculturated properly. So God doesn't explain why these particular 10, but it's a number that anyone can remember. We have a Charter of Rights that's so long and so convoluted, it's not worth having. The Americans are better off with their constitution because, of course, the people who wrote it were not Trudeau Sr., but people like John Adams, who said, quite honestly, our constitution is for a religious people. It is wholly unsuited to any other. And that's true. So, if Sinai and an experience of God won't make you good, what will? And that's what Deuteronomy 6 is about. That's the center of Judaism. And it ought to be the center of our world in terms of behavior. I'm going to test you again. Play the game, because, you know, if somebody asks you a question in a public arena and you don't know the answer and you should, do you know what getting it wrong in public does for you? You will never forget the answer again. I used to say to students, pay me $10 and I'll ask you a question about something you never remember, and you'll always remember it afterwards. That's true. As a doctor, you remember what you got wrong. Vividly sometimes. I can still wake up in the middle of the night and thankful it was a dream, when I got it really wrong. We all do. It's one of the things that's part of the job. So, the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. What comes next? Yeah, good. Be quiet. How many of you heard what he said? Some of you didn't. How many of you, let's just test your honesty, how many of you thought of your neighbor as yourself? How many of you didn't think? Yeah. That's in Leviticus 19. Normally Jesus quotes Deuteronomy, but on that occasion in the New Testament he's quoting Leviticus. And you're right. What comes next? These things shall be upon your heart. What comes after that? Diligently. That's the word you've got to get in your head. Yeah. Judaism depends upon what happens not in church or the synagogue, but in the domestic setting. And this is where the woman in our world has to get the man to do his duty. They understand that it's the man's job to see that his children hear all the stories of Israel before the age of 7. Because if dad doesn't do it, kids have hypocrisy detectors. If dad says church is very important and he goes and plays golf, you know what? They don't believe you. That's why dad has to do it. It's easier to do it yourself, yes, we all know that. But for your family and for yourself, it's the man who's got to do it. Now, what is special about Israeli Jewish history compared to every other? What's the difference between Jewish history and every other nation in the world? It's lasted longer, yeah, but it's different in another way. History, you can't get rid of history. You may not know it, but it's still lasting. Each of the kings gets an assessment grade. Either he did well or he did badly, evil or good in the sight of the Lord. What's the ratio? Well, it's about 9 to 1. There are 9 bad kings for every one good one. Does it surprise you that Jewish kids growing up with that as a normal understanding of how human beings are going to behave turns out to be a pretty shrewd businessman? They're not taken for a ride because their starting presumption is you're trying to cheat me. And usually they're right. That's our world. We are fallen creatures. You didn't become good the day after you were converted, did you? You were just under new ownership. But there's a lot of work to be done. I mean, when under new ownership doesn't mean the shop's going to be better than the previous one. It just tells you there's a hope. That's what has to happen. And it has to happen in a domestic setting, which is why the dining room table without cell phones is so important. Again, my wife intuitively understood that. When we arrived in Canada in 1980, it wasn't as bad as it is now. There were no cell phones, thank God. But she said, I am not having a microwave. I am not having the children start saying, I'll warm it up later. I will cook good food and I will try and make it food that doesn't reheat well. I want everybody at the dining room table. And you had to have a very good reason for not being there at 5:30 or 6 or whatever time she's up for that day. That's very important. Not this nonsense you see here now where people go to a restaurant and they're looking at their phones. For goodness sake. And my job was to make sure the conversation worked in a way that was profitable. That's hard work too, but it's worth doing. This is the heart of Judaism. To make sure they know their history and they understand, including even the story of the Levite who chopped up his concubine and sent bits around Israel and started a war. You can tell that to under fives. Because they just say, wow! Their security depends upon your presence. You're bothered by that story because it's really rather horrible. To them, it's just another story at this stage. They're not processing it at that point. That's going to come much later. And they need to be, the Jews understand, they were taught by Moses that they must be introduced to reality when it doesn't bother them too much, but they can take it all in. It's all there, ready to be recalled. After the Rwanda War, who were the first people to recover in the camps? 2-year-olds. They were in their house one day, and then they were under a blue tarpaulin the next. That was fun. That's the way they saw it. So 2-year-olds were playing the next day. And Mom and Dad were not going to get over it in 10 years. They're not made of Dresden china. They're very resilient. And they're being prepared for life. So, how does this work? Well, the best example of this, I always like to find it when an atheist gets it right. On my first trip to Africa in 1987, that was the year that Alan Bloom from the University of Chicago published a book called The Closing of the American Mind. It created a stir. Now, Alan Bloom was a radical activist homosexual, but also the best teacher Plato and Aristotle that the University of Chicago had in the middle of the last century. And around 1987, he wrote this book because the students coming to the University of Chicago were not good enough. The American education system was failing. Do you think it's improved since? No, not at all. And so he wrote this book. Now, if you see it in a second-hand bookshop, buy it because you'll get it for 10 cents or $1 at the most. You can throw it all away except the first chapter. But the first chapter is stunning, particularly towards the end. Alan Bloom is looking at his family history. He's a third-generation Jew in America. His grandparents arrived with nothing. They worked in the sweatshops. His parents owned the sweatshops. And he and his cousins, as he says, are all MDs and PhDs. The classic Jewish success story. Because Deuteronomy 4, 5, and 6 gives you the discipline that leads to that kind of success. But he allows himself to reminisce just a little bit. And he says this, "My grandparents were humble folk. They never went inside an institution of higher learning, but everything done in their home was spiritually rich. They found reasons for the performance of their duties and the bearing of their sorrows by reference to the book, the Old Testament. And they could go to the synagogue where they heard great scholars who spoke not from an alien perspective, but from the same perspective while simply going deeper and providing guidance. That's Bloom, and this is the best definition of a community I know. If you want this church to be a community, this is how it's done. That is what a community is," says Bloom. "A story that invites high and low, a narrative that invites high and low into a common story of meaning." Do you have a common story of meaning that holds you all together? You can't have, when you see what governments are trying to do, they're trying to break it all up into identity groups. That's their means. 20% of the population rule the rest of North America. The only way they can hope to hold on to it is by breaking up the connections between the rest. But if you have a common story of meaning, they can't do that. That's why we may have to go back to creedal statements, what we actually believe. I think we're actually there now, where even Baptists would do well once a month to recite a creedal statement, if not more. I think we will need liturgies for the same reason. There's some phrases like that prayer I started with. One prayer, I'm an Anglican these days, because it's the best church in striking distance. But I love some of those lines. Can you beat this? The opening prayer. O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Spirit. Can you beat that? It's not a wasted word. What an introduction to a church service. Don't play games here. The Lord knows it all. But instead we sing happy songs and try and make ourselves psychologically feel better. We should be singing a dirge. We've got plenty to have a dirge about. Then, when you are reminded that you are forgiven, then you've got reason to praise. I think if I was a pastor, there wouldn't be any singing till after the sermon. But there probably wouldn't be anybody at a church either. But you see what I'm saying? We're not serious. And when we are serious, things will begin to happen. Now, what Moses also says here is striking. He says, when your son starts complaining about the way you live, why do we go to church every week? It's boring. Don't say, get in the car. We all know when you've got small children, getting in the car and going to church on Sunday morning is not exactly joyful, is it? But you not to surrender to that. What he says later in the chapter is brilliant. He says, tell him the story. We have a God. And then you the story of Egypt, the Red Sea, however much is necessary. And up until about the age of 7 or 8, you can say, don't you think we ought to give an hour or so a week to a God like that? And children are honest at that level. They'll say yes, and they get in the car, no trouble. If you get them to inhabit the story, if you have a common story, but we don't. And sometimes it's when you are struck in your way that you find, oh my goodness, I didn't realize how powerful that was. On one occasion in our marriage, Sally and I fight quite a lot. You know, we both fight all of the time. That leads to a little friction. But on one particular Sunday, we had a bad row. Can't remember what it was about, but I know it was a bad one. And we hadn't actually settled it by the time dinner was served. And I said, I can't say grace. It was the most miserable meal any of us can remember. But I was being honest. They never forgot it. They all remember it. I had to repent, and we had to repent and forgive and move on. You can't say grace when you're in that state. But we turn it into rote, and we don't see what the seriousness is. So there's a lot there that you can take away with you, but it's worth doing. Another little story to encourage you to do this. A few years ago in Texas, actually, where your pastor comes from, I was there to give some talks, and I was taken in. I don't like hotels. Hotels are very dangerous places, especially for men my age with silver hair, and there are predatory women in the lobbies of big hotels in many cities. Lots of people have lost their way on the speaker circuit because of it. So I like to stay with families. That's safer. Those of you who get in that environment, you've always got Christian friends and families around. Make contact. Avoid those places. Anyway, you don't want to get caught up in that process. Make sure that you're protected whenever possible. But I was in Texas with this lawyer, a very attractive woman. I'm sure the guys had lost the case before they'd got their mind in gear when she went to court. And he was a doctor. They took me out to a meal, a very nice meal. And on the second night, it was a very nice meal again. And I said, this is beyond the call of duty. And they said, no, it's not. And they had their little daughter with them, who was about 5. And they said, we heard you speak on this subject just as this little girl was about to emerge into the world. And her dad said, I'm going to be there for her. So he changed his whole pattern of behavior. He's a doctor, but he used to finish at 4:30, go home and spend the next 2-3 hours so that he was with his daughter, read her story, go to bed, put her in the bath, etc. And then he went back to the office and did his paperwork. He said, I was much more efficient than before. Fortunately, he wasn't too far from the office. And he said, watch this. And he said, what was the name of Moses' sister? Was it Marjorie? And the little girl said, Daddy, you know it's Miriam. She's 5, and she knows the Bible stories down to the level of the name of Moses' sister. She's already got a lot of immunity to the world firmly in place, because what happens when these stories are imprinted is that they become a moral reference bank. You don't think out moral questions, you have moral models, by and large, the way we do it. And that's an incredible gift to have. That's what a family does. It gives you a voice behind you saying all the while,